We flew out of Glasgow International Airport at 06:50 hours, having been at the airport since 3:30 in the morning. We had arrived by taxi, bleary-eyed and exhausted as we hadn't been to bed. I'd thought there wasn't much point in sleeping, bearing in mind we had to be up at 1 o'clock in the morning, washed and dressed and ready for the taxi to pick us up an hour or so later. And I'd learned from experience that sometimes grabbing just a couple of hours sleep at that time of night, only to be up shortly afterwards, was the worst thing you could do, because you just can't seem to shake off the feeling of waking up almost minutes later. And besides, we would have been far too excited to sleep. As the plane took off in the still half-light, we were glad to be leaving the wet and windy weather behind in Glasgow, gathering speed on the runway, then slowing up to turn into take-off position, then engines louder as we raced along the tarmac, and then that sudden, weightless sensation of taking off and leaving the ground behind us was quite euphoric, the butterflies doing dances in the pits of our stomachs. Lucy gripped my hand as we were launched through the low cloud, almost vertically, and, tiredness temporarily overcome, we were beaming with joy at the sensation and the excitement. We were both thinking the very same thing at that split second of takeoff. Paradise, here we come. We didn't actually see much as we flew out of Glasgow, as it was so misty and cloudy, Scottish weather being mainly rain, and more rain. But as we gradually climbed higher and higher through the grey clouds, the wisps of white cotton wool rushing past the little cabin windows like smoke suddenly gave way to that beautiful blue which is always there behind them. When the signal to take off our seat belts pinged, I relaxed back into my seat and started to daydream a little, to think about how far we had come. I wanted to give Lucy happy memories of this holiday. I had so many happy memories of my own childhood holidays, and at the end of the day, when you've lost both of your parents, that is all that you have left. And I was determined to fill every nanosecond of this holiday with happiness, love and laughter, and to make it the most memorable holiday of all. When I had originally asked Lucy where she wanted to go on this very special holiday we were planning, I really hadn't been expecting the reply she gave me. I had been mentally preparing for her to be beside herself with excitement and jumping for joy, eagerly saying, "Disney World!" Up until this point, and in my mind's eye, I had been seeing us at Big Thunder Mountain on the runaway train, hurtling down the rickety tracks, laughing and shrieking with excitement and fear in equal measures as we dipped, turned and plummeted. And then we were blasting off on the high-speed roller coaster into the darkest reaches of outer space, even the men screaming on Space Mountain. And lastly, I had seen myself holding Lucy's hand as we stood in awestruck wonder watching the spectacular nighttime fireworks over Sleeping Beauty's castle, the reflections of light shining on her excited but tired face. These myriad images, just momentary glimpses of our Disney holiday, quickly dissolved and disappeared into classic Disney fairy dust, as Lucy had replied, "I want to go to Corfu." I wasn't sure whether I was disappointed or relieved, but it was definitely a reply I hadn't reckoned on. Just sun, sand and sea. It seemed like a soft option, easy and stress-free. She was right, and I had underestimated her. Before I even gave my reply, I saw an alternative Disney World, the 9-hour flight journey and turbulence, queuing for hours for each ride in the heat of the Florida sun, crowds, the constant noise and seething mass of humanity in all its shapes and guises. How many times can illusions be shattered? And I really didn't want this, of all holidays, to be spoiled in any way. There was a real risk of a Disney holiday being a shattered dream in reality, and too many of those in Lucy's mere 15 years of life, and mine too. I had then quickly snapped back to the present, and wrapping my hands around the mug of thick, sweet hot chocolate that Lucy had made me as soon as I got back from work, I sat back on the sofa. Louis, one of my white cats, immediately jumped up onto my lap, head-butted the mug just as I had taken a sip from it, which was more annoying than painful. Why do cats always do this? And then padded around a bit more for good measure to make himself comfy. Lucy was animated and reasoning that one of her school friends had been to Corfu last year and she had seen her holiday photos. She told me that Corfu looked amazing and was really keen to go there. "Mum, it just looks like paradise," she'd finished. It would also be the hottest and busiest time of year, I thought to myself, and that little doubting voice inside my head told me that, well, any popular holiday destination abroad in the middle of July would be the same. So why not Corfu then? All I could do, though, was explain to Lucy that if we did go to Corfu, we would be stuck there for 2 weeks, even if she didn't like it. The previous year we had been to a farmhouse in St Andrews, which was ruined by the fact that it had rained solidly for the full week we were there. We certainly would not be repeating a home-from-home style holiday again, and weather-wise, it had certainly been that. No, this was going to be our special holiday for so many different reasons, and if anyone deserved one, then it surely was us. We'd had far too many years of heartbreak and suffering and loss, and Lucy especially had had far more than her fair share of the fallout and things she should never have been exposed to for one so young. And I was also determined to have some real quality mother and daughter time, and not least because she is growing up fast. Despite my partner Stephen offering to come with us, which of course would have been nice, this was the time that Lucy and I had been subconsciously craving for, I think. To just be able to shut the rest of the world out and left to please ourselves. Selfish, indulgent, lovely, and a prize that together we had truly deserved and won against so many odds. And so eventually, in the April that followed, I went to the travel agents and flicked through some Greece brochures. Lucy was right. It did look a truly beautiful island and just like paradise. The sun, sand and sea was just what we needed for a relaxing time. And so there and then I booked a 2-week package deal flying out from Glasgow Airport to Corfu. Lucy would have not coped well at one of the larger, more commercial hotels, as she can find crowds and noise quite overwhelming. And so I picked a small, family-run hotel set beside the beach called Smartline Nassos in Moitika Resort. So, Corfu it was. What could possibly go wrong? Originally from the south side of Glasgow, Lucy and I had moved to our cosy 2-bedroom bungalow where we live now in Bishopbriggs in 2012. I had lost both my parents very suddenly in 2010, and then not long afterwards I separated from my ex-husband after years of domestic abuse. We had to endure 6 months in homeless accommodation before getting here, and, as you can imagine, those were very dark days indeed. 2 years after my separation, I met Alan, who I felt was the true love of my life. We met through an online dating site, and I only clicked on his profile picture because he had a ginger cat sitting on his shoulder, and I thought to myself, Now there's a man after my own heart. We spent just a few short but glorious years together, but then Alan suddenly became unwell in the January of 2014. I could feel an old familiar feeling of portent, of icy fingers creeping up and reaching out to engulf me in a shroud of black again, as history had started to repeat itself. Sick with worry, we went through the next few days back and forward between doctors and hospital appointments, and within a short space of time he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Just 4 months later, as the useless spring gave way to the first tentative hint of warmth of May, Alan died. He had left some funds for me in his will, as he had wanted me to take Lucy on a special holiday. He also left me his cat, Mimi. In the beginning, I had never really thought of myself as a cat person, and actually I used to feel that I had a fear of these somewhat aloof, independent and disdainful creatures. I think this had its roots in the fact that when I was a toddler, my grandmother had a cat that she had taken in as a stray. He was called Ginger, and whenever I went to visit my grandma, he would eye me from his perch on top of the coat rack, give that funny little bum wiggle, and then pounce on me. As a 3-year-old, I looked on him as a wily, scary cat who was out to get me every time, and so, of course, that made me distrusting of him and his kind for a good few years afterwards. I felt I was more of a dog person, really. My parents had always had cocker spaniels who were playful and loving and had no hidden agenda. The only pets I had when I was a child was a beautiful fluffy white rabbit who I named Mr. Snow, and a goldfish, imaginatively called Jaws. It was not until Lucy was a bit older, after losing her beloved little Syrian hamster just before Easter in 2012, that she started going on and on at me about getting a cat. Her relentless cries of, "Please, Mummy," started to wear a bit thin, and so eventually, like most parents, I gave in. It so happened that our local Cats Protection, formerly the Cats Protection League, rehoming centre in Glasgow, had an open day coming up, and so I promised Lucy that we would go and have a look to see what cats were needing a home. Well, I say cats plural, but I was only planning on rehoming one cat. Not so according to fate, because Lucy fell in love with 2 white cats who were brothers. We were given the chance to spend some time with them and handle them, and they were both very affectionate. Nothing at all like the so-called ginger terror of my childhood. However, the lady at the centre explained that they had to be rehomed together because they were brothers and at 5 years old were now inseparable. I told her that I really was only looking for the one cat, having never had a cat before, and I really did not want to jump in at the deep end by having 2. I had no experience of them, apart from the wily Ginger, and homing 2 felt like unnecessary hard work. However, perhaps subconsciously, I could relate to both these little creatures who would potentially grieve at being separated from each other after losing a lifelong sibling and companion. And then, when Lucy became upset and tearful, I reluctantly agreed to adopt both cats. And so after the necessary form filling and house checks, we collected Simon and Louis, so named by us after the X Factor, and brought them home just after Easter in 2012. Instead of Easter bunnies, everyone joked and told us that we had Easter kitties instead. Arriving home, we carried the 2 boys indoors to show them their new home, and in the years that have followed, they have proved to be the most loving and affectionate cats that I have ever known, especially Louis, who is so laid back and doesn't seem to mind Lucy carrying him around all the time. We can tell them apart because Louis has much larger eyes and a very loud meow, while Simon cannot mew very loud at all and is very timid. After Alan died, I took in his beloved cat Mimi as I had promised I would. It would have broken Alan's heart if Mimi had had to go into a cat shelter. He had been a stray kitten when he had taken him in and spent most of his time outdoors when he was with Alan. I cannot say that taking Mimi in had been easy because at first all he would do was hiss and spit at my own cats. Eventually, though, Mimi did settle, and when I had a conservatory built a few years later on, Mimi quickly claimed that as his own space. I'd say Mimi just tolerates my cats now, but he does get annoyed if they get too close. In 2015, I really thought we were going to lose Louis. He started to lose a lot of weight, and our vet diagnosed hypothyroidism, which was caused by a tumour on his thyroid gland. The vet tried him on various medications, but nothing seemed to work for him at first, and so he was referred to the small animal hospital, which is part of the Glasgow Veterinary School, for radioactive iodine treatment. This would cost £1,500, but at that time I would have paid anything to have Louis well again, as I didn't want Lucy to have to endure any more loss in her life. We managed to scrape together enough money, some of which Alan had left to me, so I thought it was money well spent. You can't put a price on love. He had to be kept at the hospital for 6 weeks because he literally was radioactive with all the treatment he had been receiving. But we were allowed to have him back just a few days before Christmas. We brought him home just as the first few flakes of snow had started to fall, and that eerie quiet that always goes with the onset of new snow suited the sombre occasion, as we quietly and reverently carried Louis inside the house. He was just skin and bone, struggling to walk, and a secondary problem of respiratory disease has set in now. I really thought that we were going to lose him, and so during that Christmas I had to prepare Lucy for the fact that this may be the case. Louis had always been her cat, really, and loved to snuggle up with her in her bed at night. He then had another month on iodine-free cat food, and was afterwards asked to come back for more radioactive iodine treatment. Unfortunately, the treatment failed the first time round, and on hearing this news, Lucy and I were both in tears. She had told me that all she wanted for Christmas was for Louis to be well again, but with fingers still crossed for a recovery, he went for a second bout of treatment, despite my being convinced that this wouldn't work. Perhaps because it was Christmas and the season of goodwill, the hospital provided this second lot of treatment for free. And then, by some miracle, he pulled through and got better. The head vet had been confident that his second treatment would be successful, and Louis was photographed and used as a case study at a conference later on. Meanwhile, during all this, poor Simon had been lost without his brother, as Louis was away for 6 weeks each time for the radioactive iodine treatment, and although the vet nurse telephoned me every day to give me an update on Louis, Simon, of course, didn't understand what was going on. Since then, apart from some minor surgery earlier in the year to remove a couple of malignant lumps, Louis is now the picture of health. Out of the 9 lives he was given as part of his feline birthright, although he may have used a couple up already, he still has plenty left. The build-up to our holiday had been filled with days together with Lucy and days without, as her father and I have a shared care arrangement. I was very busy at work at the clinic. As community nurse, my job can be very high pressure. We work in environments which change from day to day and which lack many of the resources that are available in hospitals. It is a demanding job, providing educational and advisory services to both patients and families, as well as involving the more practical nursing skills, such as dressing wounds, setting up drips, and monitoring ongoing care. The days tend to pass very quickly, despite being on my feet all day, and so, from booking the holiday to it finally arriving came in no time at all, or so it felt like. I had worked the day before, on the Tuesday, until 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and had taken the Wednesday off to pack. Later on in the afternoon, I picked Lucy up from her dad's, and as we drove back home, we couldn't contain our excitement, singing at the top of our voices to songs on the radio, and laughing and just enjoying the general pre-holiday high spirits. Now, just 12 hours later, we were in the sky. The flight took just under 4 hours and was quite smooth going, apart from some turbulence towards the end of our journey. Lucy had fallen asleep with her head on my shoulder about an hour into the flight. She looked peaceful and serene, and I wondered what she might have been dreaming about. I was reading a book called Blood Sisters that I'd picked up earlier that day, and also had a few Corfu pocket guides that Lucy and I had already had a browse through. A little later on into the journey, I had to very gently wake Lucy as the stewards came round to each seat and served us up a cooked breakfast. The little in-flight meal perked us up a bit after that, and Lucy stayed awake. At around 1100 hours Corfu time, Corfu is 2 hours ahead of the UK, the pilot announced that we would soon be landing, and he gave us a breakdown of airspeed, land temperature, and the local time. People started to return to their seats as the seatbelt light pinged on, and the stewards started to fasten their own seatbelts at the back as we prepared to land. Oh, we gasped as we looked out of the windows as the plane was starting to descend very quickly, not a cloud in the sky. It was so bright and sunny, almost dreamlike. We looked down at clear turquoise waters. The sea pennies sparkling on the surface of the sea and the little white yachts bobbing about. We could see white sandy beaches and palm trees and terracotta and cream-coloured houses sitting close to the beach, and oh, it looked so beautiful. We landed on the runway very suddenly with a jolt and then a bumpety bump along the scorching tarmac. The brakes were pulled hard and screeched as the pilot decelerated very quickly and masterfully. Normal landing practice in Corfu because the runway is so short. Lucy and I couldn't wait to get off the plane. Standing up on our seats, we gathered our hand luggage from the lockers above our heads and waited for a gap in the queue to leave the cool, air-conditioned plane. We made our way slowly down the aisle to the exit, said our goodbyes to the stewards who were wishing everyone a happy holiday, and stepped out into the daylight. Feeling the instant warmth of the sunshine on my face, it was like opening the door of a fan oven with that sudden rush of intense heat. It wasn't even midday yet, but already the sun was making our skin start to tingle, and the shimmering heat haze, like a mirage, hung over the tarmac and made the horizon wobble. It didn't take us long to collect our suitcases and board the tour operator's bus that would take us to our hotel. It was an exciting journey and a voyage of discovery once we had left the airport complex and reached the main road that would take us to Moratika. Our heads felt like they were on swivels, and there was so much to see. We passed by olive trees set in neat groves and the most beautiful gardens. I just could not believe the size and the vibrant colours of the geraniums that seemed to be all around us. They certainly don't grow like that in Scotland, I thought to myself wryly. Lucy pointed out what looked like little fortresses set high up above the rocky landscape and the rugged mountains, which were just in view from our vantage point. You could definitely see the Venetian and the French and British influence on a lot of the older architecture. Set against the backdrop of a peerless blue sky, it looked more like a film set from a Bond movie, and hard to believe it was real, as if it had been fabricated just for us tourists, a clever, artistic deception. At last, the bus turned off the main road and started to descend and follow the coastal road. We could see the beach umbrellas dotted along the shoreline and cheerful, colourful bars and cafes overlooking the beach, proclaiming that they sold Mythos beer from the look of the signage above many of them. We passed tourists on mopeds, the bus slowing down to get round them as they putt-putted along, unhurried and with not a care in the world. We both thought that Corfu certainly was like paradise. Lucy squeezed my hand and smiled at me, and then asked if we could go to the beach as soon as we arrived at the hotel. I could not refuse, despite feeling quite hot and drowsy, as the child in me wanted to kick off my shoes and do exactly the same. And it didn't take long to get to our destination, as we were the third hotel drop-off for the bus. It slowed to a halt just outside Smartline Nassos, and the driver jumped out to help us get our suitcases. Calling out our thanks and our goodbyes, we made our way up to the hotel's reception. The hotel looked lovely, very fresh, light and clean. Brightly coloured chairs and pictures in shocking pinks, bright yellows and deep turquoise set against the white tiles and walls made it feel very modern and quite chic. The reception was very busy as many other guests had just arrived, but it didn't take long to check in. The lady on the desk told us that the hotel rooms were still being cleaned and would be ready in a few hours, and suggested that Lucy and I went to the hotel's restaurant for some lunch while we waited. We agreed, but decided to have a quick look around the hotel to get our bearings first. The pool outside looked a good size, with wooden sun lounges all around it and bright yellow and turquoise sun umbrellas. We took our seats in the pool bar and ordered a bowl of chips and a glass of Coke each. The waiter served us with a welcoming smile and a really friendly manner, cheerfully asking us where we were from. When I told him that we were from sunny Scotland, we all laughed. It was hard to imagine the dreary mist and rain that we had left behind us, and rather like Alice through the looking glass, it all seemed to belong to a different world. We tucked into our chips, and just as we drained the last dregs of Coca-Cola from our highball glasses, the lady from reception came to tell us that our rooms were ready now. She gave me the key and brief directions how to find our room, and Lucy and I set off with our suitcases in suspense. Our room was lovely, and was situated on the ground floor overlooking the gardens at the front of the hotel. The sliding doors, which led onto our balcony, were partially open, letting in the most heavenly, heady scents of the many flowers and blossoms that were in full bloom in the surrounding gardens. We opened the doors fully and stepped out onto the balcony, where a table and 2 chairs had been placed, shaded by the tall trees, which was welcoming in the heat of the afternoon. Back inside our room, there were 2 twin beds, covers neatly folded down, and an ensuite toilet and shower room. The floors were tiles throughout and felt deliciously cool on our feet. I noticed a large television mounted on one of the walls, and my first thought was, why on earth would anyone want to watch TV in such a beautiful, idyllic setting? Well, I knew Lucy was eager to be outside again, so I quickly unpacked our clothes and hung them up in the wardrobes. She had already changed into a bikini and shorts and announced that we were going to the beach. I felt exhausted. Oh, the energy of the young. I was torn because all I wanted to do was lie down on the bed with the balcony doors open and drift off for an hour or so. After all, Lucy had had some sleep on the plane, whereas I had stayed awake. Torn between selfish and selfless, the latter won the day, of course. And so I agreed to go to the beach, as Lucy seemed so excited about it, her face radiant with happiness. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and that gave me my second wind of energy. I quickly changed, and then Lucy and I made our way back through the hotel's lobby to start the 5-minute journey to the beach. The warm earth scents mingled with the smells of food being served in the cafes and restaurants, which nestled between shops selling clothes and beach goods, and they all seemed to be doing a roaring trade. The beach itself was busy and hot, as the temperature had now hit 40 degrees, and the sweat was dripping off us. Unfortunately, all the sun lounges on the beach were full, which were owned by the bars on the seafront, and you had to pay extra when buying drinks if you wanted one. All around us, other holidaymakers seemed like they had had a bit too much to drink. It was rowdy and quite boisterous, and I could see that Lucy was feeling a bit overwhelmed by it all. The heat, the noise, the overcrowding on the beach, it was all becoming too much for her, and actually I was beginning to feel the same. We were, after a more gentle introduction to our holiday really, as we both still felt a little frail, what with this sudden change of climate, and the travelling, and having had no proper sleep. She said she wanted to go back to the hotel. I agreed, and then suggested that maybe we should come back to the beach later on in the evening, when it would be cooler, and hopefully not so busy. We turned around and made our way back the way we had come, past the still heaving beach cafes, the strains of music from each one giving us an eclectic mix from golden oldies to disco beats, but once we arrived back at the hotel it was more peaceful. We headed straight for the pool and had a glorious swim in the cool water, enjoying the refreshing change of temperature on our skin, which was already starting to turn pink from the relentless sun. We tired of swimming, and feeling much more relaxed now, we left the pool and sunbathed on the sun lounges to dry off. We positioned the parasol so that we were shaded, and I half dozed, going over the whole journey again. Lucy looked shattered but happy as she lay there listening to music on her phone through headphones. Hard to believe that the rain was probably falling at home. Vastly different from last year's holiday in St. Andrews. No parallels to be drawn there at all. It was all quite blissful and unhurried, with the thought of 2 weeks here stretching out ahead of us to do as we pleased and when we felt like it. I felt like a child again on the first day of the school holidays. We were feeling quite hungry by now. The breakfast that we'd had on the plane earlier felt more like days ago than just mere hours, and the chips at lunchtime, although very good and at the time quite filling, I was looking forward to a proper evening meal. We both were. I had booked us in for half-board accommodation, which meant that we had both breakfast and an evening meal included, which seemed a sensible plan. We could start each day with a good meal and end it too with another one, and just snack during the day, as I knew that we probably wouldn't have much of an appetite during the heat of the daytime. Dinner was served between 6:30 and 8 p.m, and as it was just coming up to 6 o'clock, we decided we'd go back to the room and have a shower and change for the evening meal. I was a little concerned that Lucy might not be able to find any food that she liked at dinner, as she is a vegetarian. But once we arrived at the restaurant, I realised I need not have worried. A huge, delicious buffet spread with a wide selection of foods which certainly catered for all tastes was set out in front of us. There was everything, from classic Greek dishes to the more traditional fare, and so she was able to choose fish and rice which she really enjoyed. I was looking forward to sampling some of the Greek specialities and chose a Greek feta salad. It tasted amazing. The olives fat and fresh, and the feta creamy, drizzled with olive oil on a luscious bed of green salad and tomatoes. It really did hit the spot. And all this good food started to make us both feel very sleepy, which was not surprising, seeing as we had now been awake for over 24 hours. And pushing our seats back into the table, we drifted back to our room to get an early night. It felt good to be back in the quiet of our own personal space. Lucy fell asleep as soon as her head hit the pillow. I was almost too tired to sleep by now, so I decided to sit out on the balcony for a little while. I opened the doors very quietly, although I doubted that Lucy would be woken. She was in such a deep, deep sleep already, her arms thrown back against the pillow like a baby's. However, I still crept out very quietly and sat down in one of the chairs to enjoy the sunset. I sat back and relaxed, bare legs stretched out in front of me, feet cool on the tiles, just drinking in the atmosphere. The cicadas were humming in the trees still, and, mixed with the distant chatter and general bonhomie of the other guests some way off, it was quite soothing. I looked at my watch. Nearly 9 o'clock. No great rush yet, then. I can have a few more minutes out here and then turn in. No sooner had I made this decision, I heard another sound, which, at first, I couldn't place. It seemed both strangely familiar and yet alien too in these surroundings. It was a faint mewing sound, and I realised that it sounded like a cat. I turned to where I thought the sound was coming from, and there on the neighbouring balcony sat indeed the cat in question, quietly mewing. She looked a delicate little thing, with a few tabby markings on her otherwise all-white body. I watched as a lady came out onto the balcony with a saucer of milk and what looked like some cold meat on a plate for the cat. She bent down and placed the dishes at the edge of the balcony and stood back as the cat jumped up and hungrily started eating the food. The lady appeared to be on the telephone. I heard her telling whoever she was talking to that she had been feeding a lovely cat every day while she was on holiday and would be sad to leave the cat behind. I wondered if this was perhaps the hotel's cat, as she seemed very confident and knew her way about. I assumed she was female, as she was quite small, and compared to my 3 males, she was half their size. A little while later, both saucer and the plate now empty, she made her way over to my balcony and sat and stared at me. I felt bad because I didn't have anything to give her. I grabbed the ashtray off the table and filled it with some water and placed it down outside the balcony's edge. I also apologised to the cat that I didn't have any food. The cat didn't move at first, probably wondering who this new person was. She must have decided that I was all right, as very timidly she came over to drink from the ashtray. After she had taken a few laps of water, she continued to sit and stare at me. She was a beautiful little cat with the most stunning and mystical blue eyes. She had a slender body, which made me think perhaps she had some Siamese in her. There was something definitely quite pedigree about her. And thinking that I had gained her confidence, I reached out in an attempt to stroke her. She was gone in a flash, running away into the night. I went back inside, quietly sliding the doors shut as I heard Lucy stirring. Sleep had finally caught up with me, and as I laid back on the pillow, the last thought I had was the sight of those piercingly blue eyes, and wondering what secrets might lay behind them. The following morning, Lucy and I still felt quite tired from the flight, so we decided that we would just take it easy today and stay around the hotel. The tour rep was coming over to the hotel at 4 anyway, and I didn't want to miss him. I wanted to book some day trips, and Lucy was keen to go on some boat trips around the island and go snorkelling. So after we had finished our breakfast, we gathered our bags and went to the local supermarket, which was just a 5-minute walk from the hotel. We stocked up on snacks and bottled water, as it was not advised to drink the tap water in Corfu. The shop had a very limited selection of pet foods, but I was able to buy some wet and dry cat food and some feeding bowls. I had already told Lucy about our little feline visitor last night while she had been asleep, and I hoped that the cat with the mystical blue eyes would visit us again today so that Lucy could meet her too. We paid for our shopping, and just as we were leaving through the side of the supermarket, we noticed a lady feeding a black and white cat. Across the road from us was a car and moped hire centre, and on the wall outside it sat a long-haired ginger and white cat. He certainly didn't look like a stray, as he appeared to be very well kept and beautifully groomed. I assumed that he belonged to the hire centre, as there was a bowl of cat food and water outside their office. It really was so reassuring to see that all these cats were being so well looked after. Food and water in bowls seemed to be in plentiful supply, and never far from any of the cats we had seen. Back at the hotel, I unpacked our groceries while Lucy changed into her swimwear. I loaded up our little fridge in the room with the bottles of water and cans of drink, put the biscuits and the crisps away, and then got changed myself into bikini and shorts. Following Lucy out to the pool area, it was surprisingly quiet, as we were the only ones about, and so we had the pick of the best sun loungers. It was very hot, and I didn't think that we would be able to do much else today in this heat. I quickly slapped on some sun protection cream and asked Lucy to do the same. I had just laid back on the sun lounger when I heard a mewing from behind me. I quickly turned round, and there was the little white cat with the blue eyes from the night before. "Lucy, quickly look, there's Misty," I whispered as loudly as I dared, as I didn't want to scare her off before she had a chance to see her. "Who's Misty, Mum?" she replied, sitting up on her sun lounger. I had decided then and there to call her Misty because of her incredible eyes. Lucy asked me who she belonged to. "Maybe she's the hotel cat," I answered, as she sat on, just staring at us from in front of the bushes. Lucy thought she was a stunning little cat too, and agreed that she had never seen eyes so intensely blue before. And Misty ran back towards the gardens at the back of the hotel just then, where the owners stayed, and so I decided that, yes, she must belong to the hotel. We spent a relaxing afternoon together. When we got too hot, we just took a dip in the pool to cool off. When we tired of that, we went back to our sun lounges and dried off in the sun, the afternoon passing peacefully, just lazing away the day. Much later on, I met with the holiday rep and booked a few trips for the coming days. The boat trip from Pago, Paxos and Antipaxos looked exciting. Set in the Ionian Sea, they are the smallest of the islands, the azure blue crystal clear waters being apparently ideal for snorkelling. And there was also a bus trip which promised a tour of the highlights of Corfu, which I thought sounded fascinating and seemed a very good way to get to see other parts of the island. After we had had our evening meal in the restaurant, Lucy was keen to try the beach again. Thankfully, by now, it was a lot cooler, and so we took a gentle stroll down to the seashore in the pleasant balminess of the evening. On our way, we passed a group of about 6 or 7 German tourists who were all crowded around something on the other side of the road from us. It made me wonder if someone had perhaps collapsed in the heat, as the tourists seemed upset and concerned. Being a nurse, I went over to investigate, just in case I could offer some assistance. And as I got closer, I could see something small and white lying next to a storm drain by the roadside. It was a kitten. Its matted fur looked dirty, and its eyes looked sticky. A can of half-eaten tuna was lying next to this pathetic little scrap. The group seemed very smartly dressed, and I assumed that they had been on their way out to dinner. I asked one of the women what was happening, but she just couldn't understand my accent. A young girl stood next to her, who I thought must be her daughter because they looked so similar. She could have only been about 10 years old, and standing there, in her pretty floral dress, I could see that she had been crying. She appeared to be very distressed about the kitten. One of the men in the group was on his mobile phone, and I thought he was trying to get help for the little mite. Lucy was standing behind me and was starting to become upset. She thought the kitten looked so sad and helpless, but thinking that the Germans had everything under control, we went on our way to the beach. It was fairly quiet by this time. One of the restaurants had moved their tables and chairs onto the beach, and there were several couples having candlelit dinners. I must say I thought it looked very romantic sitting there as the sun was going down. A few people were still swimming in the sea, and Lucy wanted to do the same, but I decided that I would just paddle. The water was still warm, as I let it gently lap around my ankles. Behind us, further up the beach, I could hear holidaymakers laughing and having fun at one of the beachside bars. I realised that it was an Elvis tribute bar. It looked great, all decked out in retro 1950s American memorabilia. An Elvis lookalike started to sing Love Me Tender, and in an instant I felt my eyes filling up with hot tears as memories started flooding back. It had been my mother's favourite song. Back in those dark days after my separation, despite meeting Alan, they were to become even blacker. My mother developed cancer of the esophagus shortly afterwards, and it was a slow, painful and cruel death, and being a nurse, I understood the agonizing months she had to endure before she succumbed to the disease and eventually died in August 2010. And it was the day of my 40th birthday. My father was devastated, as they had been together for almost 50 years and, as the brutal twist of fate would have it, they were denied the chance of celebrating their golden wedding anniversary. Just 12 weeks later, my father suffered a massive heart attack and died. I'm sure he died of a broken heart, and losing both my parents in such a short space of time, I felt as if the ground had been taken away from under me. It could have been just yesterday, all those memories suddenly feeling fresh and painful. Sadness welled deep inside, chokingly all over again. Why now? I asked myself. Why couldn't they have played Hound Dog or at least something a bit more upbeat? Anything but this of all songs. Maybe the sight of that poor kitten had triggered something deep down in my subconscious. I really had to fight back the tears now that were threatening to spill, and more than anything, I didn't want Lucy to see me like this. I cupped my hands in the sea and splashed my face with the warm, salty water to mask the hot, salty tears. Oh, get a grip on yourself, I thought to myself. Don't spoil the holiday, for Lucy's sake. I tried to shut out the song, took a deep breath and concentrated on the ripples around my feet. I concentrated so hard as if my life depended on it, watching the dying sun making flecks on the water's surface as it glittered 1 minute and darkened the next. Lucy, who had tired of swimming, wanted to go back to the hotel, and, of course, by this point, I was more than happy to leave the sea. We left the water's edge and walked back along the road to the hotel. And by now there was no sign of the German tourists or the kitten at the drain. I felt a huge sense of relief then, thinking that they must have sorted something out for it. It was a good start to the holiday then, I thought, comfortable in the knowledge that we seemed to be among animal lovers. We got back to the hotel at about 9:30. Lucy had a quick shower, then went straight to bed. I took a can of Diet Coke from the fridge and went outside to sit on the balcony and watch the dying embers of the day. I had literally just sat down when I noticed that Misty was sitting at the edge of the balcony, watching me, and I suddenly remembered the cat food and the bowls that I'd bought earlier. I quickly slipped back inside to prepare a meal and a saucer of milk for her, and then carrying these carefully back outside, I put both dishes down at the edge of the balcony. It didn't take long for her to decide that it was safe to venture over. She started eating the food hungrily, and it wasn't long until both bowls were empty. They were licked completely clean, and once she had finished, she gave a luxurious stretch and went to sit under a bush a few feet away from me. She looked very contented as she started to wash herself all over. The peace of this little quiet ritual was strangely soothing to watch. Hypnotic. It made me feel quite sleepy. I quietly got up from the chair and went back inside and, just like last night, as soon as my head touched the pillow, I drifted off, remembering those beguiling and impossibly blue, mystical eyes. The following morning, I was awoken by a faint mewing sound. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Where was I? Was I at home? Simon? Louis? And as I came fully to, I remembered that I was on holiday here in Corfu, in Greece, and the mewing was coming from the balcony. I turned over in bed and reached out for my phone from the bedside cabinet to check the time. It was early, only 6:30 a.m. I stretched and yawned. Already the sun was streaming in through the chinks in the curtains. Another beautiful day, I thought to myself. I decided that I would get up, as I didn't want these plaintive mewing sounds to wake Lucy. She is not a morning person, and to be woken this early would make her extremely grumpy. I very quietly lifted the covers up and pulled them aside, and crash! There went my phone, splat onto the tiles. I hadn't realised it had still been lying on the sheets on top of me. I looked over to Lucy, half expecting her to wake and to curse me. But no, still she slept soundly. She looked very peaceful, the sounds of her gentle, steady breathing being the only clue as to her presence at all. Well, that and her head turned away from me, so that all I could see was her hair brushed back away from her face on the pillow. Luckily, not a movement, not even an ear twitch. I tiptoed, why I don't know, seeing as it was a tiled floor, over to the patio doors and very gently unlocked and slid them back slightly, just allowing enough space for me to creep through. Stepping out into the sun, I immediately spied Misty. She was sitting in that very correct and very upright, expectant-looking way that cats do. She watched me, those blue eyes boring deep into me. I remembered to lower my gaze and to look away in classic cat whisperer style, so as not to appear as a threat to her. Quickly and quietly, I removed the empty bowls from the night before and carried them back into the room. I gave them a quick wash, being mindful not to wake Lucy with the swish and slosh of the whole routine. I wiped them dry and filled them up with biscuits in one bowl and a sachet of wet food in the other. And moving quickly, stealthily back outside onto the balcony, I set them down at the very edge and then stepped back some distance. No sooner had I reached a safe distance, to Misty's mind, she jumped up onto the balcony and started wolfing down the wet food first. She seemed ravenous and had emptied the bowl within seconds. Even my own greedy monster cats at home never ate that fast. Misty looked up at me, licking her lips, continuing to stare at me. I suspected that she was still hungry, easily being able to read cats' telepathic food-related thoughts very well. I went back inside and split open yet another wet food pouch and tipped it into a saucer. Misty had meanwhile retreated to a polite distance while her second helping was being prepared, and placing the fresh new saucer pack of food back down outside again, she was almost on it before I had taken a few steps back. I watched her devour it just as quickly as she had at the first sitting. This time, though, she decided that enough was enough and that she was thirsty now. The glass ashtray was still quite full from the night before, and so she lapped at that while I crept back inside to grab myself a bottle of water from the fridge. I took it outside with me and sat down on one of the chairs away from Misty's feeding station. She had moved a little way along under the bushes now, and was carrying out her morning washing routine. She started with her ears, and then her shoulders, her back, and her tail. Every inch of her little body got the benefit of that sandpaper tongue, nature's natural detangler. She certainly took pride in her appearance. However, in scrutinizing her this way, I realized that actually she was very thin. The bones on her back stood out in bubbles down her spine and were very visible, and her shoulder blades seemed accentuated more than on any other cats I had ever seen. It made me wonder then if she really was the hotel's cat. I mean, surely she wouldn't be that thin and continually crying out for food if she was someone's house pet. Mind you, I thought again, cats in hot countries are always quite lean-looking, and also I'd heard of cats that had several homes and would go from one person to the next, glibly eating whatever they were offered, as if they were a starving little waif and stray. The cunning, guileless cat, a creature with no shame, with about 6 or 7 people who all thought they owned him or her. Mulling things over, though, I decided that I would make inquiries at the reception later on and find out more about her. There was something quite proud about her, but at the same time she looked neglected. I wonder what I could do, though, if the hotel told me she was their cat. I mean, if she did indeed have an owner, then I was really tempted to give them a piece of my mind about their idea of cat care. I didn't want to upset the locals, but something had to be said. I wasn't entirely looking forward to finding out, though. It was still early. I leaned back in my chair, watching from afar Misty's quiet, concentrated toilette regime. My eyelids started to feel heavy, and I felt myself gradually drifting off. I must have dozed off for half an hour or so, because by the time I woke again, Misty was long gone. It was as if I had dreamt her being there at all. All the bowls empty and not a trace of her anywhere. All quiet and looking exactly as I had left things last night. I got up out of the chair and realized that the hotel and its grounds were slowly coming awake. I stepped back inside to have a shower, and then Lucy woke. We went down to breakfast, and helping ourselves to the cereals and pastries and pouring ourselves cups of tea and coffee, we planned how we were going to spend the day. We decided that we would get a bus into Corfu town. Lucy wanted to see the shops and go to McDonald's, which I didn't mind, but as I was still full from breakfast, I didn't want to argue about Big Macs and Big Tasties versus fresh local cuisine at that time of day. We popped by the reception desk on the way back to our room to find out about bus times into town. The receptionist pointed out a bus timetable that was pinned to a notice board, but before looking at the bus times, I asked if she knew who the little white and tabby cat with the blue eyes belonged to, that was frequently in the hotel gardens. She replied, "Oh, that cat's just another stray that hangs around the grounds." So my worst fears were confirmed. I felt so sad and instantly sorry for Misty. My own cats don't know how lucky they are, I thought. Pampered and every whim pandered to morning till night, they're living the dream. With a slightly heavy heart, I went back to the room with Lucy to get ready for the bus. It was only 11 o'clock, and already the heat of the sun was strong and starting to slow us down as we walked to the bus stop. Our bus was due at 20 past the hour, and so we were in good time when we arrived at the bus stop in Mizongi. A queue had already formed and was growing longer and longer as we waited. And waited. And waited. And it was now midday, and we were in full sun. More tourists had joined the queue, but after an hour had passed, there was still no sign of this elusive bus. Some people started to drift off as they gave up waiting, and other tourists were walking to the taxi rank. In dribs and drabs, people started to fan off in all directions. And by 12:30, we too decided to give up on waiting. Sweat was dripping off us both, and we were very thirsty. We decided to give up on the bus. Lucy was disappointed, but I told her not to worry. We would have a chance to see Corfu town as part of our Highlights of Corfu bus tour that I had booked for Thursday. And so we decided to have a leisurely walk around the local shops in Mizongi. It was a vibrant, busy little place. There were mini markets, clothes shops, gift shops and cafes, glorious aromas of coffee and sizzling food being cooked on open-air griddles, mingled with the tang of hot tarmac and petrol fumes. It felt very exotic, and the heat unrelenting. Seeking relief from the sun, we browsed through shops selling beach goods. Lucy picked up a large pink inflatable float which she thought would be ideal for the beach. I had already given her some spending money at the beginning of the holiday, and so she pulled out her purse and treated herself. Enjoying the relief of the shade from the sun, we hopped from one shop to the next. In a little gift shop tucked away just off the beaten track, I found a delightful little white furry cat ornament. It reminded me of Simon and Louis, who I was really beginning to miss. Lucy laughed at my purchase as I lovingly unwrapped it from the tissue paper to show her. "Mum, that's really tacky," she laughed. Oh, each to their own, I thought to myself. My cat was far more tasteful than the monstrous and garish pink float, but I kept my opinion to myself, of course. We found the supermarket that we'd shopped at previously, and I made a beeline to the scant variety of pet food section. I filled my basket with more cat food pouches for Misty, choosing the tuna and salmon varieties as carefully as if she was my own cat. I wondered if I was doing what other holiday makers had been doing, following in their footsteps and stocking up on food for that dear little cat who belonged to no one. It was funny, though, as now we seemed to pass so many more cats on our way back to the hotel, unless it was just me being far more tuned in and aware of them. One of these was a large, white, scruffy-looking tomcat. I wondered whether perhaps he and Misty were the parents of the little white kitten at the drain that the Germans had rescued. Laden down with our booty, we slowly walked back to the hotel. There was no breeze to call us on the way, only the fierce, hot sun still beating down on us. We dumped our bags back in our room and went to the pool bar to buy some ice cream to cool us down, and then we spent a long and lazy afternoon by the pool. Sometimes we'd swim, sometimes we'd lie about on the sun lounges, drying off in the sun until too hot, and then back into the pool we would go. Oh, this is the life, I thought to myself, temporarily being able to put Misty out of my mind for a while and just living in the moment. The cicadas were making their usual racket in the trees, and high up in the endless blue of the sky, small birds drifted on the thermals. No sign of any cats at all. And the water sparkled in the sun as the light dappled the surface, glinting and bobbing about in the sultry afternoon. Much later on, and after we had had dinner, we wandered down to the beach again. It was by far the best time to come down here, as it was still very warm but a lot quieter in the evenings. And Lucy was happy just to splash about in the sea with her new inflatable float, and I paddled, keeping an eye on her. No Elvis tonight, luckily, I mused. No sad thoughts, just the sheer simplicity of being in the moment. And I watched, mesmerised, as the waves gently lapped around my ankles, rolling forwards, then retreating, new waters mingling with the old, regenerated, and then doing it all over again. Forwards and retreat, forwards and retreat. Constantly the same, but ever-changing, like life itself. I pondered on this contradicting philosophy. It reminded me of an L.R. Nost quote, which has stuck with me many years after first reading it. She wrote that life is amazing, and then it's awful, and then it's amazing again, and in between the amazing and the awful, it's ordinary and mundane and routine. I had always interpreted that as meaning life was both constantly the same but ever-changing. Life is just like the sea. And so lost in these profound and reflective thoughts was I that I didn't notice Lucy until she just appeared at my side. And looking puzzled, she asked me what I'd been thinking. "Oh, just life," I told her. I could tell that she was thinking how boring a subject that was, as she rolled her eyes by way of a reply. And I grinned, and calling, "Last one back to the hotel's a sissy," over my shoulder, I hot-footed it over the sand. No way could I have ran back to the hotel. The beachfront was all I'd had in mind, but it had the desired effect. It assured her that her mum wasn't going morose or inward, and that all was well with our world. Lucy was hot on my tail now, and caught me up as I'd stopped to get my breath. And we stood together looking back at the glorious blue and orange horizon over the island. They were the colours of a Salvador Dali painting. We turned and walked along the road back to the hotel in the balmy evening. The abject peace of my earlier mood started to give way to unease and trepidation as we were about to pass by the drain where the white kitten had previously been. I felt scared of what Lucy and I might find, but there was nothing there. No evidence of a little kitten being in residence at the drain. Relief swept over me. Lucy asked what had happened to the kitten, and I told her that the German tourists must have taken the kitten to one of the animal charities to be checked over and homed. The total quiet and complete emptiness of the drain was reassuring, and I felt the earlier philosophical calm descend on me once more. All was certainly well with our world, but Lucy was still questioning. "What, like the cat's protection? Like where we got Simon and Louis from?" asked my ever-hopeful daughter. And I replied, yes, that's exactly it, and mentally crossed my fingers. I thought to myself that perhaps Misty was the white kitten's mother, and if so, what a shame that they had had to be separated. Of course, I didn't dare mention this to Lucy, as I knew she'd become upset. But the emptiness of the drain was certainly a good sign that the kitten had been taken away to a place of safety. Once back in our room, Lucy was in bed within minutes and was soon sound asleep. I marvelled at her ability to just switch off from the world like that, especially in a place far from home. And her gentle, steady breathing reminded me of the earlier sounds of the sea, its ebb and its flow sounding like sighing. However, I was far too tired to start contemplating the meaning of life again. I helped myself to a Diet Coke from the fridge, and no sooner had I shut the door than I heard that faint mewing sound that I was becoming so used to. Misty had arrived for her supper, no less. I wondered whether she had also asked at all the other neighbouring balconies, and, as I was on her supper run, she thought she'd give me a call to see if I was around. Maybe. I went through the usual evening ritual of cleaning food bowls, emptying food pouches and carrying them out quietly onto the balcony. It was funny, really, because this little chore was so dear and familiar. I'd been doing this for my own cats longer than I care to remember, and now here I was on holiday in a foreign country doing exactly the same thing. I loved the continuity of it all, and it felt strangely comforting and grounding to be carrying out this little domestic ceremony which would always be a part of my daily routine, irrespective of where I was in the world, now it would seem. I felt very at one with the universe this evening. I was able to get a very good view of my Corfu cat this time, as I'd moved the bowls nearer towards me. Misty didn't seem to mind this new dining arrangement either. As she bent down to eat her supper, I noticed a very large scratch on the back of her neck. Whether it had been there long, I didn't know, as this was the closest that I got to her yet. It could have been made by another dog or a cat, but these were secrets that only Misty was privy to. Well, Misty and her opponent, that is, if it had been caused by fighting. It was sad that this otherwise beautiful little creature had no proper home, but I really didn't see what I could do about it. I thought that she'd be fine anyway. She'd got this far, so obviously she can look after herself. Cats are renowned for it. I could imagine her being the apple of all the tourists' eyes, being spoilt with all sorts of delicacies, but always on her own terms. She knew where to go for food if she was hungry, and she knew where to go for privacy and secrecy for the one thing that cats love most: sleep. Now, if that wasn't living the dream, I thought to my new glass-half-full self, then I didn't know what was. And all that earlier philosophising about the sea as life and life as the sea, this sense of well-being and epiphany had filled me with new optimism. I had spoken to a local shopkeeper earlier, and he told me that this is just how cats live here in Corfu. They get by. And if anything is going to get by, then surely it is the cat, and usually with great aplomb. Too much thinking and all this at one with the universe business had made me feel nicely tired, and so I turned in for the night. Misty was still at her feeding station and finishing off the final few morsels of food as I gently pulled the patio doors to and locked them. I climbed in under the covers and sank luxuriously back in the cool cotton sheets. I imagined Misty having finished her supper by now and quietly carrying out her feline ablutions under the tree. Well fed, warm, and feeling the love of a stranger, she would slope off into the night to her secret place to sleep, contented, her simple needs being, once again, fulfilled for that day. Drifting off, I thought how all must be well in her world. On the Tuesday, we went on a boat trip to Paxos and Antipaxos for the day. These are the smallest islands in the Ionian Sea, and, full of natural beauty, they really are the jewels in its crown. As we left Corfu harbour, we were able to see old Corfu from the perspective of the coastline, and it looked very beautiful with its two Venetian fortresses, the old and the new, like silent, sleeping sentinels. On our way out to the islands, we stopped at the famous Blue Caves. These massive, naturally carved sea caves were breathtaking. Huge great vaults of rock rising up and out of the phosphorescent blue water that surrounded and filled them. As our boat entered one of the largest caves, it was like stepping inside a cathedral. Cavernous, cold and solid, and the rhythmic slap-plap of the water hitting the sides of the boat echoed eerily, and the oohs and the ahs from us passengers were ghostly and ethereal. The sheer majesty of it was humbling and made us feel very small and insignificant in this tiny craft by comparison. We were told to keep an eye out for the Mediterranean monk seals, as this was their natural habitat, but there didn't seem to be any about today. Once we had completed our little tour here, the boat left the cave and continued across the dazzling, crystal-clear sea towards Antipaxos. A little way on, the boat stopped again, and here we were able to go snorkeling, climbing into the sea straight from the boat. With our snorkel masks on, we lay flat on the surface of the sea, moving as one on the gently undulating surface. Looking down at the busy underworld of sea life happening below us was quite spectacular, and the sandy bottom of the sea looked so near as if all we had to do was reach out to be able to touch it. The waters were deceptive though, as we were actually meters deep. It was just the sheer clarity of the sea that made it look so shallow. Our bodies were making shadows on the bottom. Soon it was time to be back on our way once more to Paxos. We climbed back on the board again, and the boat drifted peacefully on its journey to the larger of the two islands. Paxos doesn't have an airport and can only be reached by sea, and so it hasn't fallen prey to mass tourism and is quite unspoilt. It's home to some of the oldest olive groves in the whole of Greece, and from our viewpoint on the boat, it looked lush and green as we approached the harbour at Geos, the island's capital. We spent a very pleasant, leisurely hour here exploring the sleepy fishing village. There were some wonderful, quiet little coffee shops here, and Lucy and I indulged in some of the specialty ice creams which they sold, and tasted like manna from heaven. Once we'd finished these delights, we walked around some more of the village, just taking in the scenery and the little gift shops and clothing shops. We even found a pet shop, But as it was time for us to head back to the boat, we didn't have time to go in and browse. Despite the coffee and the splendid ice cream earlier, Lucy and I were still hungry, and so we made our way to the bar on the boat. There was a simple menu on offer, but that suited us as we ordered a margarita pizza and a glass of lemonade each. The boat started to leave Paxos behind as we tucked into our very late lunch. A more blissful way to enjoy pizza I have still yet to find as we glided back out to sea in the late afternoon sun, a gentle sea breeze ruffling our hair. The trip back to Corfu took about an hour, passing again the paradisical tiny Antipaxos and the sea caves, and I had a sense of everything being in reverse now, and all the delights and explorations of the day suddenly being on fast rewind as we seemed to hurry over the turquoise sea. It dawned on me then that we were over halfway through our holiday. I wanted time to stand still. I could really get used to this temporary way of life, I thought to myself. The sun, the sea, the odd bit of culture here and there, withdrawing to poolside shade and the evening sandy beach whenever we felt like it. The little niggle about Misty's own domestic setup was a worry, but on the whole, I felt I could easily spend the rest of my days like this, being a bit hermit-like one day and then exploring the next. Arriving back in the harbour at Corfu town, we found the bus was already there and waiting to take us back to the taxi rank at Mizongi. We were back at the hotel by 7 o'clock and went straight to dinner, hungry after the journey, the sea air having whipped up our appetites again. We wolfed down our fish and chips, and then Lucy told me she wanted to go to the beach again. I felt far too tired to even think about leaving the hotel, but somehow she talked me into it. Me with the breaking strain of a soggy Kit Kat. So off we trundled, passing the, luckily, very deserted-looking drain, and the bars and the restaurants, which were all by now so familiar on our route to the beach. I didn't paddle this time, being content to just sit on the warm shoreline and watch Lucy swim to her heart's content. I felt I could easily have just lain back and drift off to sleep, but I resisted the urge, not wanting to seem like a party pooper. And besides, after my earlier jolt of realization about the stage we were at on our holiday, I wanted to save as much time here as possible. And that would only be achieved if I stayed awake, I told myself. However, in the end, Lucy didn't swim for long, and she was soon at my side again, tired, happy, and sun-kissed. Trudging back along the beach to the road, we went over our day again, marvelling at the caves and the beauty of the islands we'd seen and the waters we snorkeled in. Misty was waiting for us on the balcony by the time we got back to our room. I almost felt like she was our own little cat now. I looked at my watch. 9:30, and on the dot of. Astonished by her, as usual, impeccable timekeeping, I started the usual routine and set about preparing her supper as Lucy got ready for bed. I heard Lucy call out to me. "It feels just like home, Mum." I popped my head round the door with raised eyebrows, questioningly. "You clattering about in the kitchen washing cat dishes." I laughed and told her I'd been thinking the very same thing not so long ago. She got into bed and, as usual, was out for the count within minutes. I think that the heat and the sea air really tired her out, and I wished she would go to bed like that at home, as usually it was quite a battle to get Lucy to go to bed. I carried Mr. Supper bowls out onto the balcony, returned to grab a bottle of Diet Coke from the fridge, and then sat and kept her company while she devoured tonight's offerings of salmon. And when she'd finished, she surprised me by jumping up onto the other chair under the table and cozied herself up. No washing tonight. "Oh, Misty, I am so going to miss you when we go home," I whispered softly to her. She ignored me. I was so tempted to try and stroke her, but I knew that she'd probably flee and I'd regret it. She looked so thin compared to my great lumbering boys. And quite young too, and I doubted that she was fully grown yet. Perhaps she'd fill out as she got older, I thought. All I could do was hope. The day's outing had been a lot of fun and a lovely respite from our almost hermit-like stay here so far. But we both liked it this way, and so I didn't feel guilty. We were having the best of both worlds, I thought wearily, as I wandered back indoors and got into bed. I could hear Lucy's gentle snoring, but I stayed awake for quite a long time, just puzzling over Misty and wondering how such a beautiful cat like her could ever end up as a stray. Lucy and I were still very tired from the previous day's boat trip when we awoke the following morning. After the usual early morning feed for Misty, I showered and then we went down to breakfast. We popped to the local supermarket afterwards, as I needed to stock up on more cat food and snacks and drinks for us. We decided that today we would just have a lazy day and spend it by the pool. Lucy had bought herself a large pink rubber ring with white spots on it earlier, and so she was happy to just splash about in the pool while I read. It was another luxurious and languorous day, where we did absolutely nothing at all. An uneventful sort of day that began and ended with my Misty routine. The following day, we were glad that we'd been able to recharge our batteries. We had booked the Highlights of Corfu bus tour around the island. This was an interesting and historical sightseeing journey, which first took in the old fortress, which we learned had been one of the locations for the Bond movie For Your Eyes Only. Our tour guide was great fun. She added plenty of humour and interesting anecdotes to her talk, which really animated the whole experience and kept our attention at all times. And after we had been shown the fort, we were able to have a few minutes to ourselves to explore. We then went on to Corfu town, where we visited the Church of St. Spiridon. We learned that Spiridon is one of the most important and revered saints in Corfu, and with apparently many men and boys being named after him. As we walked back down the street to the bus, it was very warm, even though it was only 10 a.m. We could hear the cicadas in the olive trees, and our friendly tour guide told us that the hotter it gets, the louder the cicadas get. Well, Lucy was really beginning to feel the heat, and so on our way back to the bus, she bought a baseball cap at one of the gift shops to keep the sun off her head, and we also stopped for an ice cream to cool us down. The bus drove off, passing some beautiful horse-drawn carriages that were waiting by the roadside, and for the next part of the journey, this took us past the one-time family home of the famous naturalist and author Gerald Durrell, who had come to live here with his family when he was 10 years old. We stopped a little further on at the Achillean Palace, arriving at the same time as many other tour buses, and so at first it was very busy. The palace had been built by the Empress Elizabeth of Austria at the end of the 19th century. Our guide described Elizabeth as being one of the most beautiful women of her time, with her long dark hair and very slim, delicate frame, the latter due to anorexia, as it was discovered later. And her life was not without tragedy, it seemed. She lost her only son at sea while travelling to Corfu by boat, and then in 1898 she was stabbed to death by an Italian anarchist in her home country of Austria. It was hard to imagine such sadness amongst this beautiful setting, however, and Lucy and I both thought that the palace was incredibly grand, with its pillared colonnades and hanging gardens. And this had also been a location for another Bond movie, The Spy Who Loved Me, we learned. And there were some prettily decorated ceilings here, and Lucy photographed a painting of angels in the main hall, which had a special appeal to her. We left the cool sanctuary of the palace and were shown the beautiful formal gardens. There were statues and fountains here amongst the palm trees, and as I gazed at one statue in particular, of a boy with dolphins, I wondered if perhaps she'd had this built in memory of the son that she had lost. It was all very thought-provoking. Once we had left the palace, we went on to a beautiful bay where we found a small restaurant which overlooked the sea, and we had a light lunch here. The gentle breeze coming off the sea was cooling as we sat under the sun parasols. Lucy and I were really beginning to develop nice tans now. We had been really careful to keep applying the sun lotion, our pale Scottish skins not at all used to such intense heat, let alone the appearance of such an ebullient sun. And now all our fastidiousness was paying off, and although there was no way we could have been mistaken for locals, we might not have been taken for Scottish. After lunch, our next excursion was a short trip around the bay by boat. It was refreshing and exhilarating, and although not in the same league as Tuesday's island tour had been, it was wonderful to just be able to sit back and take in the landscape from our vantage point of the sea. Our round trip was soon over, and next on the list was a visit to the monastery of Paleokostritsa. Situated at the very top of a hill, it was a small monastery, but with the most incredible views over the lush green vegetation that surrounded it and cascaded down the hillside to the triple bays. On the inside, the monastery was impressive, with its carved wooden ceiling and a small museum of embroidered robes and ancient illuminated scripts and Byzantine icons. The arched inner courtyard and surrounding paved gardens of trees and flowers was, surprisingly, home to lots and lots of cats and kittens. All were very well fed and cared for here as they sat around contentedly here and there. I noticed a very large ginger cat who was sitting on top of a wall, and from his eyrie he was watching all the visitors come and go with a very wise expression on his face, us lesser mortals all meeting with his approval. He reminded me of James Bowen's street cat Bob, with his colour and his markings, and also the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland, with his inscrutable gaze. Lucy and I both agreed that it was very good to see that the monks obviously really cared for all these cats, as well as seeming to appreciate them being around. It was now time for the tour guide to gather us all up again. We made our way down the hill and was told that our last stop would be at a local cafe for refreshments before returning to the hotel. We were both quite tired by this time, and so we welcomed the chance to relax and have an ice cream and a cold drink. The bus dropped us off near the supermarket by the hotel, and so I quickly dashed in to stock up on more cat food. Misty had a big appetite for such a small cat. And by the time we reached the hotel, it was already 7:30 in the evening. We made our way straight to the restaurant and had our dinner, and I felt truly exhausted after the busy day we had had, and yet, once again, I allowed Lucy to drag me down to the beach. We were just walking past the drain when we heard a very faint mewing sound. We walked right up to it, but couldn't see anything, no sign of life there at all. And then Lucy pointed to something behind the wall next to it. Horror of horrors! It was the same little white kitten that we had seen the previous week, and he was sitting down and mewing quietly. He looked in a dreadful state, and he certainly didn't resemble the kitten we had seen last week with the German tourists. His coat was matted and covered in dirt, and his eyes were sticky and weeping, and his mouth was sore and dry-looking. I was devastated. To think that he had been here all the time, and despite my thinking that the German tourists had rescued him and been able to take him to a local animal shelter, and that had obviously never been the case. I could not believe how such a tiny little scrap could have survived a further week here in this condition, and a million thoughts rushed through my head. Dreadful thoughts of all those times Lucy and I had walked past the drain since first seeing the kitten. We'd have always been either on our way to or back from a pleasant day out. We would have been full of good food, holiday happy and without a care in the world. And how many times had the kitten just been a stone's throw away from us, perhaps? Why hadn't I gone and searched for him? Why had I continued to hold on to that stupid, naive belief that he had been rescued? He hadn't been sitting in an animal shelter at all, being fed and looked after, kept safe whilst waiting to be found a home. Oh no, not he. He'd been here all the time, while we had just laughed, sunned ourselves, and got browner and fatter by the day. The extreme guilt was exactly that. Extreme. But all this wasn't helping the kitten, who needed our help right here, right now. I sprang into action, trying to be practical. There was a small plastic tub lying by the roadside, and I quickly grabbed this and filled it up with the water from the bottle that I had had in my bag. Lucy caught the urgency and, being brave, snapped into action. "Lucy, I think we need to go back to the hotel quickly and grab Mr. Food off the side," I said hurriedly, and trying to keep any panic out of my voice, which wasn't easy. Lucy started running along ahead of me, and in no time at all we were back in our room, breathless and hot. The situation made me clumsy as we scooped up the cat food pouches and some bowls that then went clatter to the floor when the bottom of the cheap plastic carrier bag split. Lucy grabbed her backpack and tipped it upside down on her bed. Now empty, she helped me retrieve the bowls and shove them back into the bag while I refilled the bottle up with water. Then we were off again, out through reception and breaking into a jog once we got onto the pavements, and were soon back at the drain again. The kitten hadn't moved and was just sitting where we had left him. I took the backpack from Lucy and emptied a sachet of wet food into one of the bowls. The food was for adult cats, not kittens, but I didn't think that was going to matter in this case, any food being better than no food at all. And Lucy was making soothing noises to the kitten as I placed the food down in front of him. He fell on the food immediately, not shy at all, eating as if he was ravenous. He didn't even seem to be aware of us being so close, our toes almost touching the side of the bowl. I bent down slowly, and he let me stroke his back as he arched it and leaned into my hand in friendliness and acceptance. And I realised suddenly that he was purring away at the same time as gulping huge mouthfuls of food. It was a strong, loud purr, and I could feel his whole body vibrating with the ferocity of it. Once he'd completely emptied the bowl and licked it clean, he seemed to liven up and started to rub himself against my leg. And then Lucy asked me the dreaded question, which I could feel had been boiling up in her a bit. "Why is he still here, Mum?" I could see she was really trying to fight back the tears now, and now that the earlier frenetic and practical activity had calmed down, and we were able to take proper stock of the situation. I didn't know what to say then. I was feeling quite helpless, and so I just shrugged my shoulders and, not taking my eye off the little kitten, told her that I really believed that the Germans had taken him away to the safety of an animal shelter. but my voice sounded small and inconsequential. I needed to act fast now and put a plan into action. But what? I bent down slowly and tried to pick the kitten up, but he was too quick for me, and he ran away under the cover of the drain. Now what do? I thought to myself. Oh, please, Mum, let's take him back to the hotel with us, begged Lucy. But I knew that taking the kitten back to our room wasn't an option. We'd run the risk of being thrown out if they knew we had a kitten in the room, and I told her so. All I could do was to reassure Lucy that I would think of something. As the kitten had run away back under cover of the drain now, I wasn't able to get to him anyway. I knelt down and looked at his tiny little nest he'd made there. He had curled up and gone to sleep, nose tucked tightly into his tail and completely motionless, or apart from the odd flicker of his ear when a fly landed on it. I straightened up again and tried to think sensibly and rationally. Despite Lucy being with me, I did feel horribly alone now with this new weight of responsibility, for now I was seemingly in charge of rescuing this kitten. I realised there was nothing that could be done immediately, as the light was fading and it soon would be dark. I made a decision. Look, let's go back now, I said to Lucy. He's had a big supper and got some water too, and he's sleeping. We'll come back down here first thing in the morning to check on the kitten. And I didn't add, and we'll take it from there, because I didn't know where or how we were going to take anything. What were we going to be able to do for this little soul in a country where we knew no one and couldn't even speak the language? We walked back to the hotel in silence, both of us far too distracted about the kitten to talk. Lucy went straight to bed as usual, and I cleared up some of the devastation we had left behind us before we had hurried back out on our rescue mission. Lost in thought, I realised that Misty was meowing for my attention outside on the balcony. She wanted her supper. Luckily, we still had plenty of cat food left, and so I deftly filled up bowls of wet and dry cat food and carried them outside. I didn't stay with Misty tonight, as all of a sudden there seemed so much to think about and somehow try to organise. My brain was addled, and as I got into bed, I thought that I would never sleep now. However, within 5 minutes of being under the covers, I started to relax and think more rationally, trying to formulate a plan. I decided that on the morrow I would get up early, well before Lucy woke, and go down to the drain. I would take some food and fresh water with me, and perhaps in the morning, when it's light, things won't seem quite so bad, and a proper plan of action will come more easily, I thought to myself. This seemed to satisfy my nagging conscience, and luckily, a few minutes later, I too was fast asleep.